Hello, today is Thursday, April 28th, 2022. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Over the years, we've covered the on-again, off-again, and on-again travails of Sprint and its marriage to T-Mobile. Our focus, and frankly, most coverage in the media, has been on how the combined Sprint and T-Mobile would impact the U.S. wireless market. But as many enterprises know, Sprint has a pretty substantial fixed line business. I, for one, was never quite sure what T-Mobile intended to do with that side of the house, but it's now starting to be clear. And it's not good news if you're a current user of legacy Sprint for fixed line services, or if you had plans to include them in your next procurement. Let me bring in my longtime buddy, Keith Cook, to discuss what's happening at T-Mobile with these legacy Sprint fixed line services. Keith is a fellow director at TC2, and he has spent a lot of time in his career managing ICT projects. And many of those have included Sprint as one of the suppliers in the mix. Hey, Keith, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's great to be with you again on Staying Connected. So let's set the stage and briefly review the history of the T-Mobile and Sprint merger. It all started almost a decade ago in late 2013 when rumors emerged that Sprint, or in reality, the parent company SoftBank, was floating a deal to buy T-Mobile. There were lots of chatter and opinions varied, and almost immediately, industry pundits predicted the government would not allow it.
And that, in fact, didn't happen.
Correct. It did not happen then. And there were other related events, some of which are interesting. But ultimately, about 5 years later, Sprint and T-Mobile resumed negotiations and finally reached agreement in August of 2018. The deal still took 2 more years to work its way through the approval process, but it finally closed in April of 2020, just 2 years ago.
Hey, you know, Keith, it feels like it's taken a lot longer than 2 years. Now, I suppose, as you mentioned, it's been in and out of the news for just so many years. And, you know, we as a firm, we're constantly evaluating what the carriers are doing with 5G in the wireless space. And that similarly has been talked about for such a long time.
Yes. So now, given that backdrop, let's talk about something that was pretty apparent to those of us that do this stuff day in and day out, but it appears to be accelerating. And that's the ultimate demise of the old Sprint wireline network services. We're both old enough to remember after the breakup of AT&T, and long before Sprint emerged as a large wireless carrier, that Sprint really made its name by building a national long-distance network. Joe, I know you remember those "you can hear a pin drop" commercials.
Oh my God, that's so funny. Indeed, I do. You know, I also remember some of the, innovative wireless services that Sprint used to have that just never seemed to gain sufficient traction. Things like that push to talk, the walkie-talkie service, and they also, I think they were deploying WiMAX. Well, anyway, what's happening now?
Well, from the outset, it seemed like this new company's overwhelming focus was on wireless services, and we began to notice that their enterprise customers for core network services like MPLS, dedicated internet, or private lines were getting much less attention. Truthfully, this even began before the merger. But part of me always wondered, why such a lack of attention to the wireline services? I mean, after all, wireless is only wireless for the last few miles. All those cell towers are connected via vast amounts of fiber. Anyway, and as I mentioned, while we've noticed this for a while now, it seems to be becoming more of the official mantra or direction, if you will. Clients have told us, for example, that they've been informed recently that the legacy Sprint MPLS network will be turned off in about 3 years.
You know, I remember, Keith, back in the frame relay days that Sprint, it was always a viable contender, and they seemed to have a pretty capable MPLS service, and they were a pretty reliable provider. So do many enterprises use Sprint's MPLS service?
Well, truthfully, we don't have that many clients that still use the legacy Sprint MPLS, but we do have some. And we have more that still use legacy Sprint internet services. And you're right, Sprint did compete pretty well back in the day. They had a unique way of pricing their MPLS service by bundling the port and access that avoided federal USF charges, and they often beat their competitors on price by leveraging that.
So what else are you seeing and hearing?
Well, We've recently seen in competitive network sourcing events or RFPs that T-Mobile will simply no bid any wireline services. And note the distinction, I did say wireline. They are still hyper interested in wireless services of all kinds. Nothing has changed there. And it's not like there's been some press release that says they're not interested in wireline anymore. It just kind of feels to me like what has been a somewhat poorly kept secret is just of no real concern to T-Mobile anymore.
So what do you think the implications are for T-Mobile customers?
Well, I think at this point, I'd advise you to take stock of your enterprise's suite of wide area network services. If you have any type of legacy Sprint wireline service, MPLS, point-to-points, dedicated internet, and that includes possibly internet IP addresses that Sprint controls on your behalf. Make a list and an inventory, and then come up with a plan to replace those services over the next 12 to 24 months. Again, this is not a sky is falling scenario because it's going to likely take 3 to 5 years to fully come to fruition. But I do believe the clock has started, so there's just no excuse to be prepared if this applies to you.
Okay, thank you, Keith. This has indeed been a very insightful discussion and hopefully quite useful to enterprises that still have legacy Sprint wireline services. Now, if you would like to talk about this, or if you have other ICT requirements that you'd like to discuss, you can contact Keith, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or sending us an email. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to these podcasts, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.